So let's go ahead and get started. I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan. This is the Matan webinar series on topics in Jewish inclusive education. And today we're going to talk about emotional resilience for inclusive educators. And we picked this topic because inclusion is often really hard. And I think that we don't talk about the difficulties as much as we should sometimes. And so I wanted to take a step back, talk about the ways that inclusion can sometimes be hard on us as educators, why that is, and what to do to cope with it so that we can be more okay ourselves and show up for our kids more consistently. So part of where I'm coming from is that I'm a disability rights activist and advocate within the disability community. And that's taught me a lot of things that I found really helpful in inclusive education work. One way I sometimes put it is that the Torah taught me that we're all created in God's image. The disability rights community taught me how to mean that and how to be okay while I mean that. And part of what it means to mean it is that disability should be ordinary. You know, people with disabilities should be everywhere, including school. Kids with and without disabilities in school should be normal. Should go without saying that adults with and without disabilities are leaders and colleagues. Accessibility should be expected. This should just be how the world works. And we shouldn't have to fight for any of this, but we do. And recognizing that these are not things that we should have to fight for is part of how to be okay when we are fighting for it. And in the education sphere specifically, I want to just pause and talk about, why do we talk about inclusion? The reason we talk about inclusion is because for a real long time, exclusion has been the norm. And there's this huge, massive problem we've inherited because we've normalized exclusion for so long. And it's not our fault, but it is the situation we're in. And so if we understand the situation we're in, we can deal with it better. So just to give some examples of how that's the case, you know, very few Jewish adults with developmental disabilities grew up with full access to inclusive Jewish education. Very few disabled adults over the age of, around 30 grew up with full access to inclusive secular education even. People in my parents' generations with disabilities similar to mine were institutionalized and kept out of school. And I've really benefited from people who have pushed back on that. But it's still pretty normal for children with disabilities to be cut off from appropriate education, Jewish, secular, all of it. Inclusion is this new, huge, monumentous shift we're making, and it's easier said than done for a number of reasons. I'm going to skip that, I think. So part of what's really important about coping as an inclusive educator is don't blame yourself for the reality that inclusion is hard. If you blame yourself for the reality that inclusion is hard, you'll end up feeling a lot of shame and you'll end up undermining your own effectiveness. Understanding that inclusion is important doesn't erase all the difficulties involved. And, we say sometimes the most important thing is attitude, and sometimes that's true, but we can't, no amount of great attitude will solve all of these problems and erase the fact that we're doing a difficult thing. Persisting in this work becomes more emotionally tenable when you understand why it's hard, and you can't make it easy, but you can be brave, you can be happy, you can be okay. Yeah. Part of the reason that inclusive teaching is hard is just sort of the general reality that teaching is hard. And I think that the difficulty of teaching is something that a lot of people who are not teachers don't really appreciate or take as seriously as they could often. But teaching well is hard. Learning how to teach is hard. I think we've all experienced a learning curve. And learning how to teach groups of people that you're not used to teaching is also really hard. I think we've all seen people who are great with teaching, 7-year-olds but if you put them in front of a room of teenagers, they have no idea what to do. Or there's people who are great with adults but have no idea how to talk to kindergartners, or don't know how to talk to people Israelis or people with a different background, in any number of other ways. So sometimes one reason inclusion is hard is because teaching is hard, learning how to teach is hard. And inclusion means learning how to teach groups of people who you haven't taught before. And sometimes not even only that, sometimes it's groups of people none of your education mentors have taught before. Sometimes it's groups of people who nobody's really taught before. Sometimes you won't know anyone who's taught your subject to students similar to your students. Sometimes there isn't anyone who really has a lot of embodied knowledge about how to teach your subject to your students. And that's hard. It's inherently difficult. It's not your fault that it's hard. And you can do a lot to make the world better in what you figure out. Part of the reason it's hard is because disability is diverse, right? There's a standard range of difference that you might expect in most kids who are the same age. Kids with disabilities are more different than that. Kids with different kinds of disabilities are often as different from one another as they are from typically developing kids. Inclusive education involves a very wide range of problem solving. So, we have to not only learn new skills, but learn a pretty vast range of new skills to bring in people who have been excluded, and also new skills at teaching people who are different from each other in the same setting. So to illustrate disability being diverse, any of these kids could have a disability, possibly overlapping, possibly different. Like you see some kids, sitting in front of a whiteboard at a classroom desk. One of them's in a wheelchair holding a communication device. Two of them are not in wheelchairs. One of them is writing. One of them's holding an iPad. And then there's another one where there's a teacher standing up teaching music, a kid playing a guitar, and a kid playing the drum. So disability sometimes gets equated with wheelchair use, but all of these kids or the instructor could all have disabilities. For instance, all of them could have a speech disorder, they could be autistic, they could have dyslexia, they could have trauma, they could have low vision, they could be deaf, any number of other things. Disability is really diverse. You can't always tell by looking, especially if you're not familiar with noticing certain things. So teaching is hard, disability is diverse, and we don't know as much as we should about teaching kids with disabilities. Because as we learn how to teach, teachers learn what the previous generation of teachers knew. We add to it, we pass it down to the next generation of teachers and to others in our cohorts, right? And so for all the years that kids with disabilities were excluded from school, that meant that those generations of teachers weren't figuring out how to teach them. By and large, they were not off somewhere else being taught effectively. By and large, they were not being taught. They were being excluded, they were being neglected. We weren't figuring out how to teach them. And so there's a lot that we don't know that we should. And there's a lot that we're figuring out. And the bad news is that you can't fix all of this by yourself. And there isn't like somewhere you can go learn where you'll know everything you need to know. But the good news is that everything you can figure out can make the world much better, not only for your own students, but for all teachers and all students in the world who are at all similar to yours, because we're figuring it out and the things we're figuring out matter. So we're learning how to teach differently. And our methods of instruction were created by and large for typically developing kids, by and large for groups of kids who are similar to each other. And in order to be fully inclusive, we have to make some changes to how we teach. And I'm assuming everybody who's on this webinar who cares about inclusive teaching has, in your inclusion journey, made a lot of changes to the way that you teach and has sought out and benefited from a lot of expertise from others who have figured out things about how to change the way you teach. So there are things we know, there's things that you know, there's things that I know, there's things that our community of expertise knows. And there are also things we're figuring out, both individually and collectively. So creating these new ways to teach that we need involves a lot of trial and error, both in terms of figuring out our own teaching style and figuring out in the broader teaching community what's going to be effective. There's a lot of missing infrastructure. If you look at a curriculum, like if you buy a curriculum for your school, chances are it's not going to have a lot of thoughts on like, so how do you differentiate this for the full range of learners you might encounter? Some do, most still don't at this point. All should, we're working on it. Most resources sort of implicitly assume the prevailing reality of thinking most kids the same age who are being taught together all have the same physical and cognitive abilities, which is not true because we're including more people now. But we're still working out how to plan for that and how to build infrastructure that allows educators to plan for that without having to constantly reinvent the wheel. We're often taught, say in education school, if we've been to education school, we're taught methods without necessarily being taught how to differentiate them. We're taught curriculum planning without being taught how to plan for presence of kids and instructors with disease. And the mentors and experts we rely on for advice who are great with typically developing kids, might not have that level with kids with certain disabilities. So part of it is like, it's inherently hard to learn this stuff, and we don't have the kind of infrastructure. So it's there's a lot of trial and error, both individually and collectively. Yeah, I have an example slide. I'm not going to go through all the examples, but of some problems in education that I think are largely unsolved. One of which is, how do we include kids with communication disabilities in class discussions and group work? So in progressive education, most of us really like group work and really like discussions and really like participatory modalities, which is great. I like them too. There's so much you can do with them. And I think that we really need more knowledge of, so if a kid in the 5th grade has an expressive vocabulary of about 15 words, how do we include them in those discussions? If somebody needs a lot of processing time to be able to communicate, how do we include them in class discussions, small group work, and pair work? I think there are answers to these questions. I don't know what very many of them are. And these are just some examples of some problems that I think are largely unsolved, that need attention, that need infrastructure. And anybody who's trying to solve these problems is doing a hard thing and needs to have perspective about the fact that they're doing a hard thing. So part of this is that it's really important to give yourself permission to be a flawed teacher. I hear it when I teach inclusion to educators, I hear a lot of anxiety about doing it wrong. Like, one thing I hear often is, if we're going to do inclusion, we need to do it right. Or, before we need to do this, we need to make sure we're ready. I just kind of want to say, like, I'm a big proponent of doing it wrong, because doing it wrong is how we get to doing it right. There's no such thing as a teacher who always does it right, not with typically developing kids, not with kids with disabilities. And there's no such thing as an educator of learning everything you need to know in advance before you start teaching. So really, the only way to get better at inclusive teaching is to teach inclusively. Just kind of accept the fact, like, you're gonna make mistakes. People you supervise will make mistakes. You'll say and do the wrong thing sometimes. Doesn't mean it was wrong to try. Doesn't mean you're a bad teacher. Just means you're learning and you're doing something hard. So don't panic so much about needing to be right all the time, because it won't help you be right more often, and it will make you more anxious and upset. It's okay. So what do you do And how do you understand when you're working with kids who you don't know how to teach effectively? How do you keep approaching that? And how do you be okay emotionally with working with that? Because undoing exclusion can be very threatening to our identity and educators in some ways, because when we're more inclusive, we fail more. Undoing inclusion means working with a broader range of people. It means sometimes the teaching methods we know and rely on won't work in the ways we expect. Sometimes we won't know anyone who knows how to teach them. And it means that we'll struggle and fail more than we're used to. It doesn't mean you're getting worse at teaching. It means you're doing something harder. Having perspective about that helps. Don't take it personally. Don't take it out on the kids. Don't panic. Part of that is don't make success your identity. And I think a lot of educators really do make success our identity. The way we like to think of ourselves as really awesome teachers who are great with kids, who are really successful at teaching kids stuff. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big proponent of success. I like being good at teaching. I like it when you're good at teaching. But if we make success the primary barometer of identity as educators, it can cause problems when we start working with populations we're less comfortable with. Because when you're more inclusive, you're probably going to succeed less consistently. It can be emotionally confusing. It can feel, if you don't have perspective about it, like you're getting worse at teaching, but you're not getting worse at teaching. You're getting better at teaching, and you're making more mistakes because you're doing something harder. So also, I noticed somebody said, those were great questions. Would love to have them in writing after the webinar. The slides will be available, and actually they are. Daniela, can you repost the link to the slides in the webinar in the chat? Okay, so part of keeping perspective about working with groups you're less comfortable with, again, which is part of the deal, is remember that the mistakes that you make are mistakes worth making. When you try more, you fail more, but you also succeed more. Don't expect yourself to know everything in advance. Keep perspective about your mistakes and keep learning and growing. Because when you're willing to face the error part of trial and error, you also get to succeed with more people and discover new ways to succeed at teaching kids who have not been included very often. And that's a really great thing to do. Another thing that's really important for inclusive educators, and that I see go wrong a lot, is you have to value your skills, knowledge, and expertise. I see sometimes teachers not realizing that they do actually know things. I see teachers thinking sometimes that disability expertise equals therapists, and seeing therapists as the people who know these things. And the thing is, you know a lot about teaching, you know a lot about children, and the things you know about teaching and children are applicable to solving unsolved problems in inclusive education and in teaching kids with disabilities effectively. You've got a lot of useful and valuable skills that most people, including most therapy professionals, don't have. Therapists can be great, and therapy and teaching are different things. And educators have really critical expertise in figuring out how to make inclusive education work. No profession has inclusive teaching figured out all the way. We're all working on it. And the things that you bring to the table really matter because you know the most about teaching. Teachers know the most about teaching. And so when we're figuring out how to teach more kids and adults and learners, teachers bring some of the most important and necessary expertise to the table. Don't undervalue it just because it's not labeled disability. So I'm going to switch gears a little here and talk about, aside from the logistical reasons, aside from the inherent difficulty of teaching and the inherent difficulty of teaching new groups, inclusion is also hard because it makes it vulnerable to secondary trauma. And secondary traumatization is something that we talked about a lot in seminary and that I think we need to talk about more in education in general and in inclusive education in particular. So for purposes of this, our society hurts people with disabilities pretty badly. Ableism, that is to say, prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities, is really pervasive. Most people without disabilities are protected from having to feel how much disability discrimination hurts. And in order to be an effective inclusive educator, you really have to find ways to live without this protection. Because if you hold on to that protection, it becomes impossible to understand where your students are coming from and to support them appropriately. So what is secondary trauma? It's a known thing, documented, first discovered as an issue with trauma therapists, just that professionals who are frequently exposed to other people's trauma often develop trauma symptoms themselves. Inclusive education tends to increase exposure to the trauma that people with disabilities experience and to the trauma that parents of people with disabilities often experience. Because when you see our humanity, when you learn how to mean people with disabilities are created in God's image, then you see our dehumanization and you feel it. And inclusive educators really need strategies for coping with trauma exposure. And again, I think it's something that we really need to talk about more, because I think that when people don't think about it, they get hurt and they have trouble working with their students. So what are some sources of trauma exposure in inclusive education? So partly it's that what we're doing is justice work. Working for justice means facing injustice, both in the sense of being aware of it and in the sense of becoming the target of it. So awareness of injustice can be really traumatic, especially when the people being hurt by injustice are children you care about. Especially when people you admire are part of the problem, especially when you're part of the problem. And sometimes we're all part of the problem. You know, sometimes we do our best to teach someone and we end up making mistakes that hurt them. And that's not our fault, but it does hurt, and it is a source of secondary traumatization. And so we need to think about, how do we cope with being aware of these injustices and painful failures in an ongoing way without breaking. So another reason that, you know, secondary trauma exposure happens in inclusive education is, what just happened? Something weird happened on my screen and I am not sure why. Is there a weird annotation? Do you guys see that? Okay, I'm not gonna get bogged down in trying to make it go away. Got it, okay. Not sure what that was about or how it got there, but it's not there anymore. Okay, so empathy with children with disabilities comes with a price. Because kids with disabilities are often treated in ways that would be considered unacceptable towards typically developing kids. They're often subjected to evaluations and descriptions that are, you know, we would recognize as humiliating, or interventions that are physically painful or physically or psychologically invasive. And the more empathy you have for your disabled student, the more you realize that they feel just as much pain and humiliation from this as any other children do. And if you realize that, you're going to feel it some too. Because empathy with kids with disabilities means that when other people hurt them, you'll notice that it matters. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I think that one place people get stuck in learning how to be inclusive educators is that they're really afraid to feel these realities because they can feel what the consequence of seeing these things will be. And if you know that you don't have the emotional skills to cope with seeing that much pain, it's really tempting to protect yourself by avoiding seeing it. So denial does work. Denial can protect you. Denial can make you much less vulnerable to secondary traumatization. And I think that, most people, I think honestly, including myself, rely on denial to some extent, but it has a pretty serious drawback. If denial is your method of coping with the painful realities that students with disabilities face, it limits your ability to empathize with your students. It limits your ability to understand them well enough to anticipate their perspectives, see where they're coming from, understand how disability influences their understanding of the world, and really bring their voice in the conversation. Other problem with denial is that it makes empathy a threat to your stability, which is not a good situation for you. It's not a good situation for your students, and it's also not the only option. So it ultimately works better to face reality. Like, it ultimately really does work much better to face reality. And it is possible to know about all of these things without breaking. And I know that because in the disability rights activist community, we talk about ableism, we talk about trauma, we talk about torture, we talk about abuse, we talk about like really heavy things, and we support each other and we're okay. And so we disabled people learn how to cope with how the world treats us without falling apart. And educators can do that too. I'm not gonna lie, it's much, much easier said than done, but it's possible and it's worth it. So how do you do this? Part of it is learning to stay oriented. One reason that denial is so tempting is because reality is really confusing. And one reason realities can be so confusing is that different stakeholders will tell you conflicting things in the same tone of absolute moral certainty. And if you feel like you have to defer to all of them, that's an emotionally untenable situation. So inclusive educators need to be able to hold on to their own sense of right and wrong in the face of people who are really upset and speaking in a tone of absolute certainty. And it's much easier to know what's right and wrong when you know what's true, which means that getting past the need for denial makes it much easier to stay oriented and deal with all of the people who yell completely contradictory things at you about disability and education. So there are a lot of challenges to staying oriented. Inclusion is countercultural. Believing countercultural things can be very disorienting, especially when people whose judgment you rely on in other areas don't share your values there. It causes relationships with colleagues to shift in confusing ways sometimes. So how do we stay grounded? Part of it is understanding and accepting that there's a price to be paid for taking sides in a controversial justice issue, being unable to understand when that's happening. So as inclusive educators, we're taking the side of people with disabilities in the fight against ableism. Fighting prejudice means exposing yourself to prejudice. And the more you oppose ableism, the more ableism will be directed at you, whether or not you have a disability yourself. Not everyone's going to want you to succeed. Facing that reality is painful. Empathy can be disorienting because some people will feel really sincerely hurt and wounded by your commitment to inclusion and your commitment to undoing exclusion. Some people will sincerely believe that you're wronging them by teaching inclusively. The sincerity of their feelings does not mean that they're factually correct or that you've done something wrong. Their pain is real, and you can't let it stop you from knowing what's right or doing what's right. It helps to be very intentional about remembering what's at stake for your students when somebody's upset with you about being inclusive. Another reason is that committing to inclusion generally will mean that that you become exposed to more anger than you're used to from a number of directions, right? From students and families who now feel safe enough to express anger because they've kind of been resigned before, but now that they know you care, they want to hold you to it. From students and families who expect you to keep promises you've made about including them. Also, in the other direction, from people who don't want you to be inclusive, don't want you to include certain people, or from people who see that you've become controversial and want to attack you or someone for other reasons, who now see you as a safe target, or any number of other reasons. Like, inclusion is sometimes high conflict, and it's often high emotion. So just, if you're getting exposed to more anger, first of all, have perspective about the fact that this is normal and it's probably not because you're terrible. But this, sorry, I clicked too far. So it's normal. It's not a sign that you're terrible. It's the logic of the situation. So what do you do when someone's mad? Part of it is, remember, when somebody's mad, doesn't necessarily mean, anger doesn't mean they're wrong, and anger doesn't mean you're wrong. Someone being angry just means that they're angry. And that you have to think about what's going on. It's worth explicitly asking, what are they mad about? Why are they mad about it? What do I think and why? When you're confused or when you're like feeling heightened emotions, try not to make too many decisions in the moment. Make sure you're orienting and understanding, but do follow up once you've had time to process. Take the responsibility that's yours and no more. Don't blame yourself for things that aren't your fault, but also don't make excuses about things that you are responsible for. Do keep looking for ways in which you have the power to act. And, understanding what's your responsibility and what isn't, what you've done and what you haven't done, makes it so much easier to avoid getting disoriented and to deal with these difficult situations constructively. Part of taking responsibility that's yours but no more is don't invest emotional energy in bad faith conversations. When people are acting in bad faith and being jerks, don't pour yourself into convincing them of things. Don't pour yourself into showering compassion on them to get them to change, because occasionally it works, but it usually doesn't. And it drains your energy that would really be better spent on people who want to listen to you and are interested in being constructive. Being angry isn't the same as acting in bad faith. Sometimes people who are acting in bad faith sound angry, sometimes they sound calm, but it's important to learn how to recognize bad faith, because emotional vulnerability to people who are acting in bad faith is really unsustainable. When somebody is acting in bad faith, you don't have a persuasion problem, you have a power problem, and you need to figure out how to get the ability to do what you need to do despite their attempts to undermine you. Part of this is, remember, upsetting people is not the end of the world. We all do it sometimes, it's okay. It's impossible to talk about disability without ever upsetting anyone. It doesn't mean you want to be constantly picking fights, but it does mean that it's worth being realistic about the fact that sometimes people are going to be upset, and that's okay. Sometimes you're going to make mistakes that are hurtful to students with disabilities or families or teachers with disabilities. Sometimes you'll upset people who resent accessibility or your disabled students. That's not the end of the world. Upsetting people is better than silence, and sometimes difficult conversations are part of the work of inclusion. And just have perspective about that. Understand upsetting people is not the end of the world. So sometimes problems in your school will hurt to think about. And what do you do when the problems in your school hurt to think about in a way that preserves your ability to keep thinking about them and that stops you from getting hurt by them? So one thing that helps, again, is having perspectives. You're noticing the problems because your school is getting better. Being more inclusive does not make problems worse, it makes problems more visible. Remember that you're not causing the problems by noticing them, and learn to think about the problems without counterproductive shame or beating yourself up, because hurting yourself will not help. Being able to think about these things without panicking will. One part of perspective that I think is really important here is that it's really important to resist the temptation to forget that kids still exist when they're being excluded. Inclusion often feels like a step backwards because it makes the ways we are failing disabled kids a lot more visible. Teaching kids with and without disabilities together makes us confront the reality of how little we know about teaching many kids with disabilities compared to what we know about teaching typically developing kids. Often social rejection of kids with disabilities becomes very visible when we're working to build inclusive schools. And that hurts. And since we notice it more, it's natural to sort of viscerally assume that our inclusion efforts are making these problems worse, but we're not making these problems worse. Inclusion is not causing these problems. Inclusion is just making these problems more visible to mainstream educators, and it's increasing our sense of urgency about doing something about them, which is ultimately a good thing, even though it's not necessarily pleasant to notice them and face these realities. We are not causing these problems by noticing them. We are not causing these problems by being inclusive. Okay, nay. No. Part of coping with these problems is you can't go into emergency mode every time you notice injustice. Caring about something as big as inclusion means you're going to encounter a lot more injustice than you have the power to fix. When so many things are wrong, you can't constantly drop everything and throw yourself into fixing things, everything that you know needs to be fixed. Treating every important or painful problem as an emergency will not give you the ability to fix every important problem because you're only one person. It will just burn you out. The problems are going to loom large all of the time, but you can't function in emergency mode all the time. So you need to know methods of noticing these things without going into emergency mode in a way that's unsustainable. So part of how you do this is don't rely on panic or physical anger to understand that something is wrong. When you're first learning to notice that something isn't okay, outrage can be really helpful at first. It can be a way to stay oriented. It can be getting angry and physically upset can help you to remind you that something is wrong in the face of others who believe that it's okay. But long term, that kind of physical embodied outrage is too draining to be sustainable. There's a lot of good reasons to scream. Screaming is exhausting and it makes it hard to think clearly. So it's important to learn to think about the problem without having that kind of reaction. And it's really easier said than done on a lot of levels. But the more that we can be calm and matter of fact, the more tenable it is to work with these problems and to preserve our ability to keep working with these problems. So it's good to be matter of fact. So talking about disability, ableism, and accessibility problems doesn't have to be a big deal. The problems are a big deal, but talking about them doesn't have to be. Being able to talk about all of this in a matter-of-fact way makes a lot of things easier, even when something's really wrong. So, I live in the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland, and there was, as I'm sure you're aware, a white nationalist rally in Washington this weekend, and my representative organized an anti-hate teach-in last Friday and assembled a panel of experts on responding to this type of hatred. And one thing that was really great about that teach-in is everybody understood that this was a really big problem that we all needed to address. And no one was panicking. People were talking in a very matter-of-fact way about, okay, so what is this? What are these hate groups? What's the history of them? What's fueling them? And what kind of responses are and aren't effective? And because they were able to do that in a matter-of-fact way, we could have a really constructive conversation about what to do without anyone panicking. It helps with every every big problem, even one that, of course, you're going to have feelings about because it's huge. So part of this is, how do you remain aware without being distraught or ashamed? Now, often our natural reaction to noticing an upsetting problem is to feel like if we're not fixing it, there must be something really wrong with us. But that's not true. When you don't have the power to fix the problem, being ashamed about the problem is not helpful. Because what being ashamed about every problem you notice does is it conditions you to associate noticing the problem with shame, which can lead you to avoid thinking about it because you've conditioned yourself to expect thinking about the problem to be really painful. So it helps to think about, again, take as much responsibility as yours and no more. Remember that you're not causing the problem by noticing the problem. What you're doing is adding it to the list of things you may eventually be able to make better. So part of this is carrying problems with patience. Sometimes years can pass between starting to care about a problem and being in a position to do anything about it. Again, because inclusion is so huge that we're going to notice a lot of things. And sometimes years pass between noticing part of the problem, being able to do something about part of the problem. Just keep in mind, that's not a failure. That's just how it is sometimes. When you're carrying of awareness of a problem you don't currently have a way to solve, resist the temptation to slide back into protective denial and do what you can to stay out of shame. Because having the courage and the patience to remain aware of the problem is also what can make it possible for you to notice opportunities to solve it. You're not ignoring it, you're not abandoning it, you're putting it in the place where you may eventually be able to figure out something you can do about it. Take the responsibility that's yours and no more. Part of this too, coping with these difficult problems, is make sure you're listening. That's one way in which being matter of fact really is helpful, and being able to avoid freaking out is really helpful. Make sure you're listening, because your students with disabilities need you to listen to them. When a student is talking to you about a practical problem they need you to address, it's important to not change the subject to their feelings, because talking about their feelings won't solve the problem if the problem is that they can't do your lesson or the field trip isn't accessible. When a student is telling you about something they care about, don't talk over them with half-baked advice. Make sure you're listening. Don't treat the perspectives of your students with disabilities as a problem to be solved. They have a right to an opinion, they have a right to be part of the conversation, and they bring perspectives to your classroom and to class discussions that the world needs. Make sure you're listening, make things speakable. Related to this, don't ask your students with disabilities to take care of your feelings about disability. Again, this is about a way in which learning to manage your own feelings is really important. Because if you freak out when a student mentions something about their life or comes to you about an accessibility problem, if they do that and you freak out, now they have two problems. Now they have an access problem and an upset teacher. Students need to be able to talk about their lives in a matter-of-fact way without dealing with distressed adults. Students who need their teachers to fix an access problems don't need the responsibility of walking their teacher through an identity crisis on top of that. So take the responsibility that's yours and don't make your students take more responsibility than is theirs. We've got to deal with our own feelings. We can't ask our students with disabilities to do that work for us. Remember that kids and adults with disabilities aren't the problem. And again, if you have painful experiences thinking about the realities of people with disabilities' lives, the natural condition response might be to feel like they're the problem. So it's important to be very careful about reminding yourself that they are not causing the problem. It's really hard to be a kid whose life other people feel traumatized by. You know, I know people who grew up with life-threatening medical conditions who never talked to any adults about that because they learned young that the adults in their lives wanted to believe that they didn't know. And so they took care of the adults in their lives by sort of making sure that they wouldn't have to find out. So remember explicitly, they're not the problem. And remember that it's the ableism that's hurting you, not your students. It's the lack of access that's hurting you, not your student with an access need. Don't attribute the pain you're feeling to your student when they're not the one who's hurting you. And don't let fear of the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, become silence, and don't let it become silencing others. So one reason people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing about disability is because disability is a taboo topic, and violating taboos always kind of feels kind of wrong and embarrassing. So just about anything you say is going to violate the taboo to some extent. It can feel really, really embarrassing at first. This is one thing that really does get easier. And, you know, some of you are probably more acclimated to this than others, but I guess like as educators, we've all had to learn how to discuss taboo topics. And so this is one case in point of like, remember that the skills you already have are applicable and important. So part of how to hold these emotional realities is to acclimate yourself to thinking about disability and disabled experience, and to do that away from your students. So read books or other media, or, you know, go to webinars written by adults with disabilities, and process your feelings about what you learn away from your students, because it's your work and not theirs. It's okay and really, really normal to have complicated emotional reactions to some of what you learn doing this. Like, I'm disabled, I'm a pretty seasoned disability rights activist, and I still, encountering new aspects of this, I still sometimes have a fair amount of trouble. So it's normal to have complicated emotional reactions to some of this. But working through it's adult work, and it's important not to ask your students with disabilities to carry that load for you. Just acclimate yourself. One part of acclimating yourself is that it really helps to remember that as painful as some of these realities are, our lives do not consist solely of pain and trauma. Like, disabled people have lives, and we have lives worth living and valuing, and we do things besides get hurt. A lot of awful stuff happens to disabled people. That's not the only thing that matters. Good experiences and bad experiences don't cancel each other out. Our lives are worth living, both as human beings, and our disability experiences themselves bring something to the table that's valuable. If you can bear acknowledging our reality, then you get to know us, and we're worth knowing. So, please do. So I'm going to read some. Okay. So actually, I'm going to back up a little because I was just asked a question. So someone asks, could you speak more about not putting it on our students? How might that look? Okay, so I'll give you an example. So say you have a student who's a wheelchair user, and you planned a really cool field trip, and you've been talking about how great the field trip is, and your student says, like, last time we went there, all the accessible bathrooms were locked, and the lift didn't get purchased, and the lift was broken on the bus, and I got left behind, and it was awful. Part of what's necessary there in terms of not putting it on your students is, first of all, don't be defensive. Don't make your first reaction, well, you know, we tried really hard and we never leave you alone on purpose. You know, don't make your reaction, why can't you just be happy? It's going to be great. Like, you have to acknowledge, first of all, that there's an access problem, that your student wants to know that they'll actually be included on the field trip. And there's also an emotional safety and validation problem, just that your student is telling you something that's really hard and they need you to respond constructively. And they also need you to, like, first of all, not be defensive, not refuse to listen, not poo-poo it, but also the other kind of reaction that's not helpful is for you to, like, have a really demonstrative emotional reaction where you go, oh no, that's terrible, I'm so sorry, that shouldn't happen, that's not the kind of teacher I want to be, this is not who we are as a school, like, ramps are important. You know, that puts it on your student in a way that's not constructive or fair to them. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box because I'm watching it. So I'm going to read some quotes from, you know, some disability rights leaders who have meant a lot to my understanding of a lot of the world. This is Harriet McBride, a quote from Harriet McBride Johnson in her book, Too Late to Die Young, Nearly True Tales from a Life. She was a lawyer and a leader with muscular dystrophy who was one of the people who started the annual protest against the Jerry Lewis telethon, which has sort of been foundational in how a lot of disabled activists have responded to degrading disability awareness efforts. And so here's something she has to say about disability experience. Are we worse off? I don't think so, not in any meaningful sense. There are too many variables. For those of us with congenital conditions, disability shapes all that we are. Those disabled later in life adapt. We take constraints that no one would choose and build rich and satisfying lives within them. We enjoy pleasures other people enjoy and pleasures particularly our own. We have something that the world needs. So this next quote is from Julia Bascom. It's from her post, The Obsessive Joy of Autism. She's the head of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and, you know, a really incredible leader. If I could change 3 things about how the world sees autism, they would be these. That the world would see that we feel joy, sometimes a joy so intense and private and all-encompassing that it eclipses anything the world might feel. That the world would stop punishing us for our joy, stop grabbing, flapping hands and eliminating interests that are not age appropriate, stop shaming and gaslighting us into believing that we are never and can never be happy, and that our joy would be valued in and of itself, seen as a necessary and beautiful part of our disability, pursued and shared. And that, from Julia Bascom, from The Obsessive Joy of Autism, is a blog post, and it's also a really nice picture book that I would recommend acquiring. And so, one more quote here. This is from Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, who's a queer disability theologian at Georgetown. And disability invites us to rethink the nature of divine power, to jettison the classical image of God as the one who can upend mountains on a whim. When God wants something done, brute force simply will not do the job. God cannot pick up a single stone without a human hand to lift it. When God desires direct action in the world of matter, she must inspire and control, adapt and orchestrate, trust and yearn. God too, I suspect, finds it occasionally frustrating. Imagining God in and through my wheels puts a different spin on a critical religious issue. If God wheels through the world, then I suspect that she often has an access problem. In this world built for striders, armored against flow and spin, how can we let God in? So, you know, there's all these diverse perspectives, all that's brought to the table, and we're we're worth knowing and we have things to say worth listening to. And learning to get past denial and accept the gritty realities also gets you access to the richness and the depth and the beauty of disability experience in your life and in your classroom. Solidarity is stronger than denial. Empathy for people with disabilities is really unbearable when you're feeling it by yourself. So the best thing is don't be alone. If no one around you shares your perceptions, find someone who does, because you're not the only one. Find ways to act on what you know and show solidarity, and it is so much more emotionally tenable than denial. And this picture is ADAPT, direct action disability rights activists on the way to an anti-torture protest. That was a difficult day, but we're all fine. And being able to face that allows us to show up for each other, know each other, and be powerful and happy. So don't expect yourself to be able to fix stuff with a Care Bear stare. In the Care Bears movies, and I'm aging myself a little here, so if you're too young to remember this, I apologize. But in the Care Bears movie, the heroes could solve any important problem by caring and assertively telling others that they needed to care. Every time they couldn't solve a problem, it was because they were failing to care enough. In real life, caring's not enough. You have to also have power. Don't beat yourself up wondering if you're failing to care enough. Look for ways to be powerful. Don't personally attack yourself. Don't expect to be able to erase all of this by being a good teacher. The way our culture teaches children and adults with disabilities will affect your students' experience in your classroom. It will affect their relationship with you and their peers. No matter how good you are, that context is going to matter. Don't take it personally. You can be a good teacher. Being a good teacher does not make the world go away. So teach as well as possible in the context you're operating in and keep learning. Part of this is finding power and learning to be powerful. Most people have more power than they think they have. When you accept that caring doesn't create power by itself, it can enable you to find the things that do. Real world power doesn't work like the Care Bear stare. It's partial, it's not necessarily satisfying, but it's real and you can use it. You won't have the power to fix everything you want to fix, but you will have the power to fix something. The more you keep looking for opportunities to make change, the more opportunities you can find. And if you keep perspective on that, it makes you more effective, and it also makes you more emotionally stable and happy. Another part of being powerful is being brave. So inclusive education is a justice movement and a culture change movement. All change is hard, all change involves loss, all change involves risk, which is why in the Matan Institute for Education Directors, one shift we've made is to really spend a lot of time talking in practical terms about how to make change, why change is hard, how to handle it. So just putting in a plug here for the Matan Institute, but all change is hard, all change involves loss, all change involves risk. It's a price to be paid for doing this work, but it's worth it. Being brave makes you more powerful, and integrity is one of life's greatest pleasures. And if you can take joy in the change you can make, in the ways you can be brave, in the ways you can teach well and show solidarity, it really helps with both effectiveness and happiness. Sometimes it helps to be Jewish. I honestly kind of don't know how I'd cope with a lot of this if I wasn't Jewish, because the legacy of centuries of exile and anti-Semitism has certain things in common with the legacy of exclusion of people with disabilities. We actually know a fair amount about responding to collective trauma constructively, just because so much of the Jewish spiritual experience is around holding collective trauma. We know a lot about facing intractable problems without falling into despair. Again, it's a lot of our liturgy. It's a lot of the realities of exile and difficult situations. And I found that leaning on our spiritual tradition to make a lot of this work more bearable, because inclusion is hard, but coping with centuries of anti-Semitism is harder than inclusion. So, and as it says in Pirkei Avot, it is not upon you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. Okay, so see, we're at 2:00, and I also see that there's a couple of questions in the box. So I'll stay on for a couple more minutes for questions. So a couple of people have asked, please address the issue of acceptable terminology for those of us who worry about using the most appropriate terms. And also, should I say special needs or disabilities? So here's the thing about that. I have opinions about that, but what you need to know is that there's no universal answer to that question because all of the terminology is contentious. I think that this is a matter of knowing your community and what will work in the context you work in. And I think it's a matter of letting people use the language that works for them. The one word that you should never, ever use is retarded. You should not use it in the clinical sense. You should not let people use it as an insult. You should not say people with mental retardation. All of those words will cause people to lose trust in you permanently and will do serious damage. So don't use any of those words. In terms of special needs versus disability, the reason I believe pretty strongly personally in using the word disability is that all of the civil rights legislation surrounding disability uses the word disability. The idea of disability rights and the idea of positive disability experience uses the framework of disability. Special needs to me feels kind of like othering and kind of clinical. And also the next word is often like kind of implicitly kids. And I'm an adult, and even people who are kids, I want people to be aware that they're growing up and they're not going to be kids forever. So that's why I use the language I use. We'll probably do a more extensive webinar on language issues at some point, but just, it's kind of a game you can't win. So part of it is just like, expose yourself to different approaches, know your community, and don't say the R word. We've instituted a new evaluation for our webinars. So if you would be willing to include it, to complete it, it's in the chat box. It'll also be in the email afterwards. Talia Johnson comments, I find special needs implies that the person or organization is doing people a favor by providing accessibility rather than normalizing it. Yeah, that's one reason I'm not a fan as well. Like, I'm not special, I'm human, and accessibility should be normal and not seen as special or above and beyond because we just need to be part of the world. And I believe someone else said, it has helped me to cope as an inclusive educator. If I think about how I address coping with family members who have an impairment, I work at bringing that level of patience and reality to my work. So I think that certainly can be helpful. And also, any framework you have for patients or for patients surrounding disability, I think can be very helpful. Using family as an example can be helpful. It can also be a double-edged sword because I think that it's important to be mindful of the fact that, sometimes there's a presumption of intimacy with people with disabilities who have access needs. And sometimes people feel like they're closer to us than they really are, or like that if they're meeting our access needs, we should reciprocate that by being more emotionally close to them than they'd normally expect from a colleague or a student. So I'd say that framing can be really helpful, and also be careful that it's not interfering with your understanding of the boundaries involved. Okay, so we're a little past the hour, so I'm going to conclude now. Please, if you can, take a moment to fill out the evaluation. And if you have any other questions, I can be reached at rabbi@matankids.org. And the slides and the caption recording will be sent out once we've got it captioned. Thank you, everyone.